The extraordinary evidence exhibit number 1 is man himself. Modern man, Homo Sapiens, is a stranger to Earth in many ways. Modern scientists have tracked life on Earth backwards, inspired by Charles Darwin, who stunned academicians and theologians of his time with his theory of evolution. From man and primates, mammals and vertebrates, and so on, backwards through ever more primitive life forms to the point where life is thought to have begun billions of years ago. Recently, there's been a lot of discussion on life elsewhere in our solar system and beyond, but scientists are concerned about life on Earth. It doesn't seem to belong here in any way. Why does all living things on Earth have too few of the chemical elements that are abundant on our planet, and too many of those that are rare? If it began through a series of spontaneous chemical reactions, why does life on Earth have but a single source, and not a number of chance sources? Was life brought to Earth from somewhere else? The puzzle has been made more difficult by man's privileged position in the evolutionary chain. We are the only animal to have the ability to think about our environment critically and therefore change it according to our needs. Scholars first assumed that man descended from Asia 500,000 years ago, based on the discovery of a shattered skull here and a jaw there. However, as more ancient human fossils were discovered, it became clear that the pace of evolution for other animals is much faster than it is for human beings. The progenitor apes of man are now estimated to have lived some 25 million years ago. Discoveries in East Africa suggest a 14-million-year-old transition from apes to humans, the hominids. The first ape man worthy of classification, Homo, only arrived there around 11 million years later. The earliest fully human-like creature, advanced Australopithecus, lived 2 million years ago in those same places of Africa. Homo erectus took another million years to evolve. After slightly less than another million years, the first primitive man arrived. He was given the moniker Neanderthal after the location where his remains were discovered. Despite the fact advanced Australopithecus and Neanderthal lived over 2 million years apart, their tools, sharp stones, were nearly identical, and the groups themselves, as they were thought to have looked, were barely indistinguishable from each other. Then, 35,000 years ago, a new species of men, Homo Sapiens, the thinking man, came out of nowhere, sweeping Neanderthal man as a pure breed off the face of the earth. These modern men, known as Cro-Magnon, looked so much like us that they would be lost among the masses of any European or American city if dressed in modern clothing. Although they were dubbed cavemen at first because of the caves which housed the spectacular paintings they created, in fact they traveled the earth freely, because they knew how to construct shelters and dwellings out of the stones and animal skins. Man's tools had been simple stones with useful shapes for millions of years. Cro-Magnon man, on the other hand, created specialized wood and bone tools and weaponry. Now, he wasn't a naked ape anymore, he wore skins. His culture was well organized, and he lived in patriarchal clans. His cave drawings evince creativity and emotional depth. His drawings and sculptures reveal some type of religion, as seen by the devotion of a mother goddess, who was sometimes portrayed by the crescent sign of the moon. He must have had unique views about life, death, and perhaps even an afterlife, because he buried his deceased. The puzzle is even more intricate than the appearance of Cro-Magnon man, which in itself was strange and inexplicable. As more remains of modern man were discovered, it became clear that Cro-Magnon man must have descended from an even earlier Homo sapiens that lived 2.5 million years before Cro-Magnon man in Western Asia and North Africa, a theory supported by the discovery of the Denisovan fossils. We cannot be 100% sure how the prehistoric humans appeared on Earth, but we can suppose that Neanderthal man did not evolve from Homo erectus, but that both of them evolved from some other predecessor. The debate about the evolution of man is still ongoing, but it is very possible that modern man came to Earth much later than previously thought. It is completely improbable that modern man appeared 700,000 years after Homo erectus and 200,000 years before Neanderthal man. It's also obvious that Homo sapiens represents such a radical departure from the traditional evolutionary process that many of our characteristics, such as the ability to communicate, are unconnected to the earlier primates. For instance, we have 2 copies of each of our genes, one from mom and one from dad, so we have 2 copies of the gene for language, FOXP2 also. To speak well, people need 2 working copies of this gene. Just 1 working copy causes an inability to speak well. No working copies causes death, at least in mice. A leading expert on the issue, perplexed by the fact that this rapid development of language occurred during an ice age, a particularly unfavorable period for evolutionary progress, concluded, "Modern man has many fossil collateral cousins, but no progenitors. The derivation of Homo sapiens then becomes a riddle." Pointing out that Homo sapiens lacks some of the previous known species' idiosyncrasies and has those that have never been seen before. Scientists even theorized that the first humans to populate the world were likely Neanderthals and non-Homo sapiens. A study of DNA of 27 human fossils found that Neanderthals, and not modern humans, were likely the first hominids to leave Africa and start spreading across Eurasia some 200,000 years ago. The study by a team of geneticists and archaeologists was recently published in the journal Nature. It is based on analysis of mitochondrial DNA from the fossils, as well as genomes of living people. So how did modern man's ancestors arrive a mere 300,000 years ago, rather than the expected 2 or 3 million years later as a result of further evolutionary development? Were we brought to Earth from somewhere else, or were we formed by the gods, as the Old Testament and other ancient traditions claim? We now know when and where civilization began, as well as how it progressed after it did. The unresolved question is, why did civilization emerge in the first place? Because, despite all evidence, as most scholars now admit with exasperation, man should still be without civilization. There's no clear reason why we should be any more civilized than the tribes of the Amazon rainforest or highland portions of New Guinea or other remote areas of the globe. We're told that's because they've been isolated. These tribesmen still live as if they're in the Stone Age. But from what are they isolated? Why, if they've been living on the same planet as us, haven't they picked up the same scientific and technological knowledge on their own that we have? The main conundrum, however, is not the first peoples under development, but our progress. It is now widely acknowledged that, in the normal process of evolution, man should still be exemplified by bush people, not by us. It took man 2 million years to progress in his tool industries, from using stones as they were found to realizing he could chip and mold them to better fit his needs. Why not give us another 2 million years to learn how to use different materials, and another 10 million to perfect mathematics, engineering, and astronomy? After all, we've landed astronauts on the moon less than 50,000 years after Neanderthal man. This begs an obvious question. Did we or our medieval forefathers truly develop this great civilization all on our own? Despite the fact that Cro-Magnon man did not build skyscrapers or employ metals, his civilization was without doubt revolutionary. His mobility, ability to build shelters, desire for art and leisure, to dress himself, make tools and jewelry, all of these things were a sudden high civilization, breaking an unending beginning of man's culture that spanned millions of years and progressed at a painfully slow evolutionary pace. Though contemporary scientists are unable to explain the origins of Homo sapiens and Cro-Magnon man's civilization, there is no doubt that they originated in the Near East. The uplands and mountain ranges that stretch in a semicircle from the Zagros Mountains in the east, where modern-day Iran and Iraq meet, through the Ararat and Taurus ranges in the north, and down westward and southward to the hill lands of Syria, Lebanon, and Israel, are teeming with caves where prehistoric, but no less modern, man's evidence has been preserved. Shanidar, One of these caves is located in the northern portion of the Civilization Ares semi-arc. Even now, during the chilly winter months, the tough Kurdish tribesmen still seek the area's caverns for sheltering themselves and their livestock. And so it was 44,000 years ago, on a cold winter night, that a family of 7, one of them just a small baby, took refuge in Shanadar's cave. Their bodies, which had been crushed to death by a rock fall, were discovered in 1957 by Ralph Selecki. In all, 9 skeletons were discovered, with only 4 being crushed by rockfall. Though he had gone into the region looking for evidence of early man, what Selecki discovered was far more than anticipated. As more and more rubble was removed, Selecki was shocked to see what the curious cave revealed. Shanadar Cave preserved a clear record of man's presence in the area, not just in the recent past, 13,000 years ago, but all the way back some 100,000 years. The information revealed by the timeline within the cave was as startling as the discovery itself. Man's culture has regressed rather than progressed. Starting with a specific standard, subsequent generations demonstrate not more advanced, but less advanced civilized life standards. From 27,000 BC to 11,000 BC, the regressing and dwindling numbers reached a stage where there was almost no population at all. Man was virtually completely gone from the entire area for 16,000 years, for causes that are thought to have been climatic. Then, around 11,000 BC, thinking man emerged with renewed vitality and a cultural level that was inexplicably higher. It was as if an invisible coach observing the stumbling human game dispatched a new and better trained team to replace the fatigued one on the field. Throughout the millions of years since his inexplicable birth, man has been a child of nature, surviving by gathering wild foods, hunting wild animals, and catching birds and fish. But just as man's settlements were dwindling, just as he was departing his homes, just as his material and artistic triumphs were vanishing, man became a farmer, seemingly out of nowhere and without any preceding time of gradual preparation. While eminent authorities on the subject concluded that genetic studies have confirmed the archaeological findings, and it leaves no doubt that agriculture began exactly where thinking man had emerged earlier in his first crude civilization, in the Near East. The discoveries of Göbekli and Karahan Tepe have cemented the fact that agriculture expanded around the world from the Near Eastern arc of mountains and highlands. According to scientists from diverse fields of study, wheat and barley production was man's earliest farming venture. Using modern methods of radiocarbon dating and plant genetics to refine their views, researchers have found it is most likely through the domestication of a wild species of grain called emmer. Even if it's assumed that man learned to domesticate, develop, and farm a wild plant, gradually over time, scientists are perplexed by the abundance of other plants and grains essential to human sustenance that continued to emerge from the Near East. Millet, rye, and spelt, among the edible cereals, flax, which gave fiber and edible oil, and a wide range of fruit-bearing shrubs and trees were among the plants and cereals essential to human existence and advancement. In every case, the plant was probably cultivated for millennia in the Near East before finally reaching Europe. It was as if the Near East was some kind of genetic botanical laboratory, overseen by an unseen hand, and generating a new domesticated plant every now and again in a burst of imagination. Scholars that have researched the grapevine's origins have concluded that it was first cultivated in the mountains of northern Mesopotamia, Syria, and Palestine. It's understandable. After all, it's recounted that after his ark rested on Mount Ararat, as the waters of the deluge subsided, Noah planted a vineyard, even becoming intoxicated on its wine. The Bible, like scholars, also places the beginning of vine growing in the northern Mesopotamian mountains. Indeed, we can't help but recall that the Old Testament identified the same area as the world's first orchard several millennia before our scholars. And the Lord God planted an orchard in Eden, in the east, and the Lord God caused to grow out of the ground every tree that is pleasant to behold and that is good for eating. Apples, pears, Olives, figs, almonds, pistachios, and walnuts are all native to the Near East and have spread from there around the world. The biblical generations were clearly aware of the overall location of Eden. It was to the east, that is, east of Israel. It was in a land irrigated by 4 major rivers, including the Tigris and Euphrates. This first orchard, according to the book of Genesis, was located in northeastern Mesopotamia, in the mountains where these rivers began. The Bible and science are completely in harmony. In reality, if we read the original Hebrew text of the book of Genesis, as a scientific text rather than a theological one, we would discover that it precisely explains the process of plant domestication. According to science, the process began with wild grasses, progressed to wild cereals, and then to cultivated grains, and finally to fruit-bearing shrubs and trees. This is identical procedure described in the first chapter of Genesis. And the Lord said, "Let the earth bring forth grasses, cereals that by seeds produce seeds, fruit trees that bear fruit by species, which contain the seed within themselves." And it was so. The earth brought forth grass, cereals that by seed produce seed by species, and trees that bear fruit which contain the seed within themselves by species. When expelled from Eden's orchard, man had to toil hard to cultivate sustenance, according to the book of Genesis. "By the sweat of thy brow shalt thou eat bread," the Lord said to Adam. It was after that Adam and Eve's children began agricultural careers. Abel was a keeper of herds, and Cain a tiller of the soil. Man had become a shepherd soon after he'd become a farmer. Scholars agree the biblical sequence of events is correct. In Domestication of Animals, F.E. Zunner examines the many hypotheses surrounding animal domestication and concludes that man could not have got the habit of keeping animals in captivity or domestication before he reached the stage of living in social units of some size. Following the transition to agriculture, such permanent communities arose, which were required for animal domestication. Around 9500 BC, the dog became the first animal to be tamed, although not necessarily as man's greatest friend, but most likely for food. The first skeletal remains of these early dogs has been found in Iran, Iraq, and Israel. Sheep were domesticated about the same time. Remnants of sheep from around 9000 BC have been discovered in Shanidar Cave, indicating a considerable portion of each year's young were sacrificed for food and skins. Goats, which also provided meat, skins, and milk, soon followed. Pigs, horned cattle, and hornless cattle were next to be domesticated. In every case, the domestication process started in the Near East. Scholars have labeled this dramatic change in the course of human events, which occurred around 11,000 BCE in the Near East and some 2,000 years earlier than Europe, as the end of the Old Stone Age, the Paleolithic, and the start of a new cultural era, the Middle Stone Age, Mesolithic. The name is appropriate considering man's principal raw material continued to be stone. His mountain homes were still made of stone. His settlements were surrounded by stone walls. His first agricultural implement, the sickle, was still made of stone. He utilized stone to build figures of the highest creatures or gods, whose benign intervention he desired, and to honor or protect his deceased by covering and embellishing their graves with stones. However, from a broader perspective, the period beginning around 11,000 BC should be regarded as the age of domestication rather than part of the Middle Stone Age. Man had become a farmer. Wild plants and animals were tamed in about 3,600 years, overnight in terms of the everlasting beginning. Then came the dawn of a new epoch. Our academics refer to it as the New Stone Age, the Neolithic. But this phrase is also inappropriate because the fundamental change that occurred around 7500 BCE was the advent of pottery. For reasons that confound our scholars, but will become evident as we unravel our story of prehistoric events, man's march towards civilization was confined to the highlands of the Near East for the first several millennia following 11,000 BCE. Mankind's descent from his mountain abode toward the lower, mud-filled regions coincided with the discovery of clay's many applications. The Near Eastern arc of civilization was teeming with clay or pottery cultures by the 7th millennia BC, producing large numbers of utensils, decorations, and statuettes. By 5000 BC, the Near East was creating high-quality clay and pottery pieces with spectacular designs. However, the growth slowed once more, and by 4500 BC, archaeological evidence indicates that regression was again widespread. Pottery got more straightforward. Stone utensils, a legacy of the Stone Age, became popular once more. There are fewer remains in inhabited places. Some of the sites that had been hubs of pottery and clay industries began to go away, and distinguishing clay production vanished. At this time, there was a widespread decline in culture, and certain sites clearly bear the traces of this new poverty-stricken phase. The deterioration of man and his culture was blatantly obvious. But then, surprisingly, bizarrely, the Near East witnessed the birth of the greatest civilization known to man, a civilization in which our own is firmly based. Man was once again rescued from his decline by a mystery hand who brought him to an even greater degree of culture, knowledge, and civilization.
Thank you.